Well, kia ora, and welcome to Martin Lubberink, who is an associate professor at Victoria University of Wellington and is an expert in essentially bank capital regulation and an advisor on that as well. Welcome into a mini-Hoon on the Kaka, Martin.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Kia ora.
It's always great to find another bank capital nerd. I love a good discussion about capital requirements, and this actually is really important because our big banks, and particularly the big four, play such a role in our economy. And there was a lot of controversy from 2017 to 2019 as the original bank capital increase was pushed through, largely driven by Adrian Orr. And now that he's gone, there's been a review, and today we got the results of the review, the proposals for change for a general listener, someone who might have a mortgage or a term deposit. What's the sort of what's the outcome today of this review so far?
I think it's a good review. I read through it, most of it, and I think it's very reasonable in the outcomes. There's nothing really that is going to make a big dent, and that is exactly what you need. This is part of the Reserve Bank policy on financial stability. And by issuing a report like this, I think that contributes to financial stability.
So could you just sort of set the scene for us? The 2017 to 2019 review. What was the Reserve Bank then trying to achieve, and what have people thought since then about whether it was a good idea or not?
I think it started with a small incident or accident when capital instruments from Kiwi Bank suddenly disqualified and then requalified, which kind of made me worried about what was going on when it comes to capital at the Reserve Bank. Now, then I think after the FSAP from the IMF, which is kind of like the IMF visited the Reserve Bank in at some point, I think in 2017, they issued a report about the bank. And then after that report, the FSAP report, the Reserve Bank started moving on capital. And they started, um, like, in a way, they wanted to increase capital ratios, which I think is okay. That's fine. We are not Europe. We're at the bottom of the planet, and therefore we need robust financial markets. Now, the thing was, and as I think I highlighted it in my blog, is that at some point, you can announce whatever capital requirement you want, but it has to be credible. And there's, I think, where the Reserve Bank missed the mark because quite quickly after the first consultation report in 2018 or 19 or so, 18 it must have been, the, the Reserve Bank started backtracking, and then the ultimate result in 2019 was a watered down version, but it was still very high. And so over the last 5 years, we've noticed that banks kept on complaining, and politicians started chipping in or moving in this debate. And then also on a global level, worldwide, most of the regulators are revisiting Basel III, which is basically the origin of the higher capital standards after the global financial crisis. So this is in the context. There's two things I think that matter much here is that the world is moving towards revisiting capital requirements. Whether that's good or not, that's a question for later. And then there's political pressure, I think, in New Zealand, but I would not give that a very high weight per se.
So the banks have sort of pushed back since 2019,
Yeah.
looking to reduce the amount of capital that they're required to hold because it's been a staggered process and it hasn't actually finished yet, the original
hmm
plans. Are the banks justified in pushing back? Because the Reserve Bank said in between 2017 and 2019 it wanted to make sure there was enough capital for a 1 in 200 year event because that's the way they look at insurers. Do you think that was too tough, too conservative?
I think there's two things here. First, the story about the 1 in 200% or the probability of a systemic failure, that has become a red herring. I think it was sort of mentioned once, and then there's the story that Adrian Orr single-handedly pushed that from 1 in 100 years to 1 in 200 years. but there is no prudential supervisor in the world that uses such a very narrow number. And so that has created its own dynamics. And I think that was a communication mistake from the Reserve Bank. Um, the other thing about whether the banks complain, it's a constant. Like you breathe and you drink water, the banks will always, and they push because for them, pushing for lower capital, in particular the large banks, if they push for lower capital, that is basically the lobbying is not as expensive, but the rewards are very expensive. So if you have a low cost, high reward issue, then you obviously will go for pushing for low capital ratios. I've been in this field since the financial crisis, and it's a constant.
Yeah, so the banks will always push for lower
Yeah,
capital,
yeah,
and this time around, the Reserve Bank has said, okay, uh,
yeah.
and the net effect, according to the Reserve Bank in the document, which tallies up with your own calculations, is that this will in effect reduce the capital requirements for the banks by around 5 percentage points. Just to give us a sense of how that's happened, because it's not an obvious number when you look at the tables involved, because the way that bank capital requirements work, the Reserve Bank or the regulator says to the banks, you must put aside a certain amount of capital for each loan that you put out there, and not all loans are the same. Some loans are riskier than
Hmm.
others, and you must put more capital aside for those risky ones than the
Yeah.
safe ones. How has the Reserve Bank managed to come up with that, the easing of 5 percentage points?
I think they did a proper they executed a proper strategy here. What they did is not so much move the headline capital requirements, because if you look at it currently, banks are required to hold 10%. That will move to 13.5%. They call it common equity tier one. So that percentage is meant to be moving to 13.5% if the plan still goes ahead, like the 2019 plan. So, but now the Reserve Bank comes up with these proposed new ratios, which are 14% and 12%, which is hardly different from the current set. So, and at the same time, they say, well, we significantly lowered the capital requirements, and that is because of the denominator. So the risk weights for particular groups are being relaxed based on data that the Reserve Bank probably accumulated over the last 15 or 20 years. And they said, well, maybe the failures in the agri industry are not as bad, and maybe most New Zealanders pay back their home regardless. So why would we have high risk weights attached to these assets? And so they lowered the denominator. They said, well, we don't have to give these assets a very high weight. And so we'll keep the numerator kind of flat. We're not going to change the numerator, but we're going to change the denominator. So shrink, what is it? They lowered the denominator, which I think is good, because it will be, if in general, if you change the denominator, you will probably have less discussion because people don't know what goes in the denominator. I think it's to be honest, I think it's a very very smart trick that they did here, because you deflect future discussions, because nobody knows exactly the calculations of the denominator. Ideally you would have the dashboard featuring all the asset groups and the weights and so forth, and what contributes to what in terms of the denominator, but it's going to be opaque.
Yeah, there's a very good table, though, in the summary document, which
Yeah.
talks about the reduction in the risk weightings for various different types of loans, ranging from a high LVR loan, so something to a
Hmm.
first home buyer, for example. The risk weighting goes down from 35 to 25%
Yeah.
for an investor who has, an LVR of over 50%. That goes down from 40 to 35. And for a farm with a loan to value ratio of less than 30%, so, not a big debt compared to the value of the property, goes down from 100% to 50%.
Hmm.
Do you think, looking at these risk weightings and overall what's happened here, that the banks will feel they now have a bit more freedom to lend into these various areas? Do you think that it might, create over time a bit of a zhoosh of extra lending into these various sectors?
I, I'm very cautious about this because in the end, it's about risk and real risk and the pricing of that. And even if the proposed, if you look at the table goes in particular for the farms from 100 to 50%, a bank will not willy-nilly lend to a farmer even if his activities are very risky or deemed to be very risky. So it lowers the floor in a way, but on the other hand, banks and supervisors have the responsibility to make sure that there's no reckless lending going on. And so therefore, it's it's a bit of lowering the floor a bit, but then there's still these supervisors who may step in and say, well, actually, or maybe the bank itself says, well, actually, we want you to pay more interest to cover the higher risk that we think your farm has.
Just finally, this, according to the Reserve Bank, the two options involved for the big four would reduce the amount of capital they've got by around about $7 billion. Is there a chance here that some of the measures, including lowering the threshold for an entrant to become a bank or a deposit taker from having $30 million capital to $5 million capital, changing some of these risk weightings, could increase the amount of competition in the market? Or is there a risk here that the banks will just say, wow, $7 billion, I'll send that to shareholders?
Yeah, well, I suspect the latter more than the former. Small competitors like Revolut or Monzo in the UK, they struggle. The market will want them to have far more than the minimum amounts that you just mentioned, and so therefore you have to be sizable to start in the first place, even if the requirements are lower. So that's not going to make a dent, I think. What helps is things like the ability to do innovative work, less regulations on things that impede innovations. And the other thing is, and I think that's a missed point from the Commerce Commission also, if you go through the report from the Commerce Commission, there's nothing there that puts the big four into a position that they have to do some extra work. And these are the well-resourced banks. They have lots of resources and money and talent also to come up with innovations. And if you go through the Commerce Commission report, there's nothing expected from the four banks in that area. And if I were in charge of the banking system, I would tell the banks like, hey, we want these innovative features like instant payments or instant mortgage approvals, and we give you 5 years to come up with a AI system that accomplishes that so that we can be the envy of the world in terms of innovation. But there's very little about that. So there's almost nothing there in the Commerce Commission report that tells banks to become more innovative. And these are the best placed banks. The small banks some of them can't even issue credit cards. What do you think that they're going to offer in terms of innovation? Nothing. It has to come from like what Europe does. The European regulations are such that the larger banks are imposed or told what to do, like number portability and fast transactions between countries. It is all very top down. And I think if Minister of Finance or whoever is in charge of that, they should pay attention to a top down approach more than a bottom up approach, because if you leave it to the banks to sort out these issues in terms of innovation, nothing will happen because the smallest player will veto any progress.
Martin, thank you very much for coming on to a mini-Hoon here on the Kaka. We've been speaking to Martin Lubberink, an associate professor at the Victoria University of Wellington, specialising in bank capital regulation. Cracking chat, Martin. I'll be making sure that people can also go through the show notes to read your excellent blog summarising today's news and get access to previous pieces you've written on this. It's great.
Okay. Thank
Thanks,
you very
Martin.
much.
Cheers,
Okay.
Martin. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.